Hi, everyone. I'm speaking to you from the home office here and want to talk to you about political ideologies. The first thing I'll say is that Chapter 4 of Introduction to American Government does give you a more in-depth and a good historical background for each of the different ideologies I'm going to talk about. In fact, I would recommend strongly that you read that. It's not required, but recommended. I'm going to talk about them in a little less depth and just give you a big overview of different political ideologies. Um, First of all, who cares? Why are ideologies important? Well, one of the most important things to understand about ideologies is they do present a filter, a way of understanding the world that everybody has. I don't think there's any such person who doesn't have ideas about politics before thinking about them. Okay, now one of your ideas might be it does not matter. It's all equally baloney. Okay, well, that is one way to look at it. I don't agree with it, but that's still an idea. Okay, that's still a way of looking at things, a way of looking at the world, a worldview. Ideology sometimes has a negative um, connotation to it, and maybe that's fair. But another way to say it is that everybody has a worldview, a way of looking at politics. Again, you could say it doesn't matter, or it's just a bunch of hypocrites, but that's still a way of looking at the world. And what our worldview does, or our ideology does, is help us to make sense of things. Um, and we often think that, oh, I don't have an ideology, but the people I disagree with have an ideology. But that's not really the case. It's not. Everybody's got a way of looking at things. And one important thing to do in politics is as we study politics, is to try to really understand um, how people have different views of the world than we do, to try to understand how do they work, even to try to kind of climb inside that worldview and see how it operates for someone else, and then step outside and say, okay, what, how does that work, and why do I disagree with it? And even to try to do that to our own too, to try to get a little bit of distance from it. Say, okay, how would somebody thinking about things differently think about this? Okay, now I don't think we can ever totally get out of our own way of thinking, but we can try to understand different ways of thinking, explain them in ways that people who hold to those views uh, could recognize. That's important. Okay, and then try to make some kind of intelligent response to it. The other thing I was going to it's important to think about going into it is that you can meet people who are trying to be honest and fair and thoughtful, that subscribe to almost any idea. Um, and you can meet people who are unfair and not trying to be thoughtful and just trying to score points, who subscribe to almost any ideology. So I would encourage you, try to find people who are thoughtful and fair and open to conversation from any different kind of idea. Um, and don't judge an idea by its most obnoxious um, supporters. Okay, so for example, let me give you one example of this. I'm not a communist. I think communism has been a terrible, terrible idea, and a terrible system that's killed millions, obviously, as a matter of historical record. One of the writers I actually enjoy reading is a Marxist, an avowed communist. Now, he's not a supporter of Stalin, anything like that. I find him to be honest and fair, uh, and willing to criticize his own side. Very upfront that his goal is a communism that works this time. I can't imagine a communism that works. That wouldn't be an affront to many of the things that I believe in. But I actually enjoy his writing because I find him to be honest and thoughtful and fair. And you can find people like that from almost any ideology. For me personally, I would have a tough time finding a Nazi that I could think of like that. I, can't imagine that, because it's sort of avowedly uh, wants to destroy people. But um, anyway, most ideas, anyway, I think you can find somebody who's thoughtful about it. Now, um, the two mainstream kind of ideas in our our political system right now, we tend to call conservative and liberal. Okay. And Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a Democrat from New York, senator, also an aide to Richard Nixon, I believe, before he was a senator, had a good statement that I think helps us to think about conservatives and liberals. And that statement was the central conservative truth is that it is culture, not politics, that determines the success of society. The central liberal truth is that politics can change a culture and save it from itself. Okay. I think that's a really insightful point, and it gets to some of the major disagreements. Another way to summarize what he's saying about conservatism is conservatives are skeptical that politics can ever be more healthy than culture. Um, and therefore, there's pre-political things, foundational things that are more important than what laws we pass. Okay. Um, and that's, I don't know if I came up with that summary myself, or I don't remember anymore, but that's kind of what conservatives are saying. Another famous quote by a conservative activist. Yeah, I don't know if he made this up or what, but is that politics is downstream from culture. In other words, culture comes first; it impacts politics later. Okay. Um, then the central liberal truth is that politics can change a culture and save it from itself. In other words, a liberal, contemporary liberal, is going to say, well, if we just wait for the culture to get better, there's going to be all sorts of people hurt by that. And so actually politics can change culture. We can have things like the Civil Rights Act that um, outlawed segregation in public spaces. We can have uh, court rulings like Roe versus Wade and laws that um, make it easier to get abortions to promote what they would see as equality for women on those fronts. Okay, um, so that is a really insightful contrast, I think, between conservatives and liberals, generally speaking. Okay, now what does it actually mean to be conservative and liberal? Okay, now one thing to understand is we don't really use those terms in America in exactly the same way that people in other parts of the world do. Um, but for our purposes, let's just stick with how we use them. Okay, uh, the root word of liberal is liberty. So it is a philosophy of liberty. Um, and I'll start with that one because in many ways that's conservatism today is more of a response to liberalism in the 20th century. So liberalism, contemporary liberalism, is a philosophy of liberty, and it's saying in a lot of ways that not only does government need to leave people alone in certain areas, generally speaking, and freedom of speech and freedom of religion, moral issues, moral decisions, individual moral decisions to some degree, um, but it also is saying that government has a positive role to play. Um, Introduction to American Government talks about the positive state. Okay, so while government should allow individuals to hold their own beliefs, it also, and to express themselves, it also has a role to play economically, especially in providing individuals with the ability to exercise their liberties with, say, economic regulations, minimum wage laws, welfare programs for those who need them. Um, they have a more positive role of government, okay, in mind. And to put those in place, you have to have programs with bureaucracies. That is kind of the key of contemporary liberalism. It really starts with the New Deal in a serious way, making an impact on American life, American political life. Okay, so Social Security is there to provide a supplement to retired people's income. Also has programs to um, aid people who come into unfortunate circumstances, say the death of a parent. Okay, people with disabilities. The building on that in the 1960s was the Great Society, most especially things like Medicare. Okay, Medicare is medical care government provided for people that are retired. Okay, Medicaid is a state level program funded in part by the federal government to give medical care to those who are too poor to afford it themselves and don't have insurance. Okay, so these are programs, as you can probably tell, that have a very positive view of government to be able to say government has to act to help people where they don't have other options. That's the kind of positive view of it. Um, and especially you have the idea here that capitalism is for liberals basically a good thing, but um, it has a lot of holes in it, they would say. Um, that capitalism doesn't help everybody. It tends to help the wealthier. It tends to help upper middle class pretty well. But there's a lot of people who will be left behind if you just leave things up to capitalism. Therefore, you need government to intervene. You need it to both regulate capitalism so it doesn't get too out of balance. So uh, businesses don't do things that end up leading the economy to crash, to get too out of control. And then also that you have a certain amount of redistribution of wealth. Okay, higher taxes on the wealthy, uh, programs to uh, give some of that money to the poor, or either in services or through um, checks and things like that. Okay, there's different views of how to actually accomplish that, but that's basically kind of contemporary liberalism as it develops, okay, in the um, 20th century up through the 1970s and 80s. Now, one of the major crises for contemporary liberalism was the economic slowdown of the um, 1970s. Um, Inflation was high, unemployment was high, things seemed to be behaving very differently than contemporary liberal economists thought they would. Okay, and not surprisingly, the contemporary liberals started having trouble winning elections. There was another aspect too, that contemporary liberals had become more critical of American military um, engagements like Vietnam. Okay, um, and so some people began to think that there were, contemporary liberals were not patriotic enough. Okay, they weren't proud enough of what the country accomplished. Okay, and that led to Ronald Reagan winning the presidency, um, the rise of the conservative movement in the that we'll see in a few minutes. And so one of the big questions then was, had contemporary liberalism gone too far to the left, too far against capitalism? And we see the rise of what we call neoliberalism that your book describes too. And neoliberalism is a different kind of way of thinking about liberalism that says, well, we ought to think about not being too unfriendly to business. Maybe liberalism had gotten too unfriendly to business. We should have support taxes going down a bit. That should be more um, friendly to markets. Maybe we can, instead of building more public housing, we can have programs that encourage banks to give people loans to buy their own houses. Okay, that markets have a role in this. We can try to reduce poverty more through business friendly policies than through regulation and redistribution. Okay, and the great example of that was Bill Clinton. Um, and this leads to a big tension within liberalism, between contemporary liberals and neoliberals. Okay, the great example of contemporary liberalism is probably Barack Obama. Um, and there was tension between him and the Clinton wing of things, that he thought maybe they had gone too far in to being business friendly. Okay, neoliberals tend to be more business and capitalism friendly, but also tend to be, as long as they're within the Democratic Party anyway, um, also quite um, pro-choice on abortion, especially these days, tend to be quite pro, in favor of expanding rights and protections for LGBT people. Okay, um, so that's a big uh, tension in contemporary liberalism. And now you're seeing probably the pendulum swing back a little more towards the contemporary liberals, where you see most Democrats saying they want Medicare for all, which would be an expansion of government involvement in healthcare. Okay, we could talk more about these tensions in class if you have a question. Now, what about conservatism? Conservatism. Um, well, contemporary conservatism is more. Uh, it's more a response to contemporary liberalism. Okay, uh, conservatives, in one sense, are classical liberals, meaning that they also believe in the Constitution. They also believe in individual liberties. Okay, uh, there are some tensions with that, but we'll have to talk about it. Now. Contemporary conservatism really finds its voice in the 1950s, um, and there's a phenomenon that's sometimes called fusionism. Fusionism means that you have different strands of conservatives coming together, especially represented by National Review magazine, um, and really represented at the political level by Ronald Reagan um, in the 1980s. But fusionism binds together a couple of important concerns. There are libertarians, or at least economic libertarians, who think the government's gotten too big in regulating businesses. There are um, there are excuse me, not only economic libertarians, but there are also foreign policy conservatives who think that the government needs to be even tougher in waging the Cold War and opposing communism. Okay, that even though Democrats were going against communism, that it wasn't hard enough, and they needed to press things like Vietnam harder. Okay, um, there was also social conservatives. Okay, who wanted to who were concerned about some of the changes going on in American society, greater sexual um, liberties, challenges to the traditional family, um, concerns about uh, how sexual morality was changing. Okay, and there's also people weren't so sure that civil rights for black people or women might have been going too fast, or shouldn't have been going at all. Um, every ideology's got its complexities, um, just as there were people who were kind of pro-communist in the contemporary liberal circles early on. Okay, so it's a fusion of these different concerns makes the modern conservative movement. Okay, people who are anti-abortion are generally going to go along with this too, and so fusionism is a powerful coalition. Um, Fusionist conservatism is a powerful coalition for the Republicans in bringing Ronald Reagan to the presidency and opposing contemporary liberalism, saying that it's just too much government, too much spending, welfare programs that just spend and spend and spend and don't actually change anything. Okay. Now it's important to understand too that just because conservatives don't view things like healthcare or anti-poverty programs as necessarily the government's responsibility, that they don't care about poor people. Um, it can seem like that, and presumably there are some conservatives who don't care very much about poor people, I suppose. But generally speaking, conservatives are going to say it's other people's responsibility not to force it through tax money, but charity groups, private groups, stronger communities, families. So rather than offloading these things to the government, they uh, ought to be we have to be encouraging a stronger society that can help people. Okay, so that's a sense of fusionist conservatism, the modern conservative movement. Okay, I'll just say too, there's a misconception about liberals too that they're just socialists. Okay, well, no, not really. Yes, do they want government to do more? Yeah. Does that mean that they're wanting to have a totally government-controlled economy? No. Okay. Um, so that's a contemporary uh, conservatism versus contemporary liberalism. Contemporary liberals, a strong, positive government that can do more to um, attack economic inequality, that can do more to promote racial equality, that can do more to promote equality for women and for um, LGBT people, especially in the past couple decades. Um, Equality is defined by uh, more equal opportunity and more equal conditions and results. Okay. Contemporary conservatism says if you put too much power in government, it gets out of control. It does too much. It's inefficient. It doesn't actually lead to as much economic growth as you might think. And you also have to be careful that government isn't overturning long held traditions and actually um, destroying some of the fabric of American life by replacing the way that things have been done in the past, replacing the family, replacing local communities, replacing religion. Okay. Now, what's the big tension in conservatism lately? Okay. Well, fusionism, as I said, was a very powerful alliance. Um, but kind of one of the ongoing crises for American conservatism comes after the defeat of the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Okay. The Soviet Union falls, the great enemy of communism is gone, largely, at least Soviet communism. But then what? Okay. And there's some inherent tensions among those different groups that are part of the conservative coalition. Because you could see, for example, all right, you have economic libertarians. You want as few regulations on business as possible, um, as long as people aren't defrauding each other and stealing from each other. Okay, but that's not necessarily going to always be the same way that social conservatives think about it. Um, you might have businesses that support values that don't go along with social conservatism. Okay, um, you might you just the other day that 180 CEOs signed a letter that encouraged Georgia and other states not to have bans on abortion. Okay, those businesses saw that as attacking women's equality. Well, social conservatives see abortion as an attack on um, unborn human beings. Okay, and businesses sometimes will be more liberal socially. Okay, not always, but sometimes. And so there's those kind of conflicts. What about foreign policy? Okay, should foreign policy conservatives afterwards sometimes will become neoconservatives that say, and we should be promoting democracy around the world, but others are going to say it's not really the job of the American government. And do we end up promoting do we end up really being able to do that? The war in Iraq is a good example of some people being very optimistic. We can go and we can try to set up an American friendly and American style government in Iraq, and others saying, oh, that's not really our job, and get people killed there. Um, so those kind of tensions too. And then free trade, it's another one too, like bringing China into the global economy. Economic conservatives oftentimes who want free trade, yeah, let's do that. Social conservatives and other kinds of conservatives might say, but what about jobs that are lost in manufacturing here? What about the fact that China is a communist country that doesn't necessarily play fair on trade? Um, and so, and finally, another tension is social conservatives look at the history of American politics since 1990 or so, and say, well, so a lot of our issues like abortion and the traditional family haven't done all that well in politics, and maybe we need to be thinking about a government that tries to support um, some of these values more, as opposed to just worrying about the processes and everything. So an example of that would be, I recall the Concerned Women for America, which was and still is a social conservative group, wanting the government to be less tolerant of cable companies that say, "Hey, you either get the big package or you don't get it at all," and say, "Well, we want more choice in what channels, and want to play for the channels that have, say, more explicit or sexuality, things like that." And so they wanted government to regulate that more. Okay, whereas an economic conservative might say, we need to allow the companies to make their own decisions. Okay, so those are some of the major concerns, and I think Donald Trump is an obvious, um, you know, sort of example of how that old fusion doesn't necessarily hold anymore in the Republican Party and the conservative movement. Um, Trump was not a traditional conservative, not a traditional Republican, but he won the nomination, right? And so he appealed to some degree to the more social conservatives, even though he didn't have a particularly socially conservative history or lifestyle. But to the appeals to order and to supporting the military, supporting the police, um, to worries about getting taken advantage of by other countries um, in trade. Uh, he did not really appeal to economic libertarians very much. Um, he criticized the war in Iraq. Okay. Now, how he's actually governed has been more traditionally conservative so far. But the is the Republican Party going to go more in a nationalist direction that's less open to free trade that the Republicans wanted? These are questions that can't answer yet. But every ideology, if it's broad enough, has tensions within it. There are debates about how to do things best, what should be most important. Now, the last couple things I'll say here are about about two outside the mainstream ideologies. One is democratic socialism. You hear more about that lately with the rise of Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the Democratic Party. Democratic socialism says that even contemporary liberalism is too friendly to capitalism. Okay, you don't just need more regulations; you need an assault, in a sense, on the system that has this coziness between business and government. Okay, so at a minimum, you need universal health care. Um, you need something like a full employment program that would guarantee a job to everybody who wants one. Okay, uh, you need to think about, without going the communist route, you need to think about more government provision, things like free college or taxpayer-funded college, um, that will give a bigger role to government in American life, because it will then guarantee fairness and equality, according to democratic socialists. Okay, and um, socialists in general will say that capitalist system really is something that needs to be dramatically reduced, and a full-on socialist would say capitalism needs to go, somehow, to take things out of the market, provide services through the through public means, through the government. Okay. Um, Libertarians, on the other hand, are kind of the polar opposite. They say that the government is just simply too big. It doesn't. Both Republicans and Democrats want to tell you what to do. Democrats want to tell you how much you can work for, or how much to pay your employees. They want to tell you um, what uh, what prices. They have too many price controls. They want to tell you how to spend your money. They want to tax you and give your money to other people. And Democrats just aren't willing to let you alone and use your own money as you see fit. That's fundamental economic liberty. And the libertarians would say, Republicans want to tell you how to live your life. They want to tell you who you can have sex with and when. They want to tell you um, uh, that, uh, no, that's one of the primary ones. They want to tell you if you can have an abortion or not. They want to tell you uh, all sorts of things about your private life. They want to tell you how to live your life. So Democrats want to regulate your money. Republicans want to regulate what you do. Um, want to regulate drugs, things like that. As long as things don't affect other people, libertarians say, as long as the only person I'm hurting is myself, I should be free to do whatever does not harm another person. Okay. Um, and they would see themselves as going along with the Constitution as well. Okay. Standing up for the individual rights that we ought to have. Okay. Libertarians are a fairly small group, like Democratic Socialists, but they're also say that the two parties really don't help uh, help out very much. Instead, what we need is a real commitment to individual liberty. Okay, and sometimes libertarians will vote Republican, sometimes they'll vote Democrat, sometimes they vote for libertarians. Okay, um, and so those are some of the other ideologies that don't tend to have a lot of voters, but they tend to grow in times, I think, of discontent with the main parties, and you can find interesting writers and advocates for both those as well. Um, so just to sum up the big picture here, contemporary liberalism tends to think that government has a positive role, um, and contemporary liberalism is divided between people who want to keep pushing on that role, expanding government programs to make, as they would see, make capitalism fairer. And then on the other hand, the neoliberals who worry that actually that's going to um, turn people off, and that you can try to have a fairer capitalism with smaller regulations, um, or by not reducing regulations, but by doing things more efficiently and not being too hostile to business. Okay. Um, the misconception about liberals is that they're just socialists, and it's not really true. If you ask the socialists, right? Um, Conservatives, they it's an interesting time right now. The movement seems to be a bit in flux, but they tend to want to be 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 to preserve. They're trying to conserve things, preserve a certain amount of tradition, the Constitution, usually the um, oftentimes religious and traditional values that are American, um, and they don't trust government nearly as much to solve problems. They might think the government makes things worse unless it's really acting on their values. Um, and there's kind of a divide between the fusionist conservatives, as I said, who want government to act according to the Constitution, um, and have a pretty positive view of American um, ability to have a foreign policy that's influential in the world, are confident in capitalism. And some of the post-fusionists or people critical of that who are a little more skeptical that economic conservatism and social conservatism and foreign policy conservatism can all work together quite as well. Um, and one of the major tensions now is just what I said. The misconception, as I said, is that conservatives don't care about the poor. Um, that's not exactly true, but they're skeptical of the government programs can really help in the way that liberals say they can. Um, Socialists, democratic socialists, want a bigger government role. They're sort of contemporary liberals, but more so and more skeptical of capitalism. Uh, and then libertarians want the government to do as little as possible to, yes, have a military to protect us, but not to go out abroad very much. They want individual rights. They want government to prevent people from killing and stealing from each other, but to do as little as possible and allow people to do whatever they want to that um, doesn't hurt others. All right. I will be glad to take questions. I hope this is helpful to some degree. Hope it's very helpful, but at least hope it's a little bit helpful in thinking about these ideologies. Please feel free to ask questions in the discussion or in class. All right, we'll see you on Wednesday.